Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we will continue our reading of Storm in the Village by Miss Reed. Chapter 22. Fairacre Waits and Wonders. The Nativity play, which took place in St. Patrick's Church 3 days before Christmas, had occasioned almost as much comment as the proposed estate. This was the first time such a thing had been attempted, and the innocent vicar, whose only thought had been of his parishioners' pleasure in praising God in this way, would have been flabbergasted could he have heard some of the criticisms. "Nothing short of popery," was Mr. Willett's dictum. "Play actin' in a church. I don't hold with it." "It's been going on for years," I pointed out mildly. "Churches were used quite often to perform plays for the people." "When?" asked Mr. Willett suspiciously. "Oh, a few hundred years ago," I replied. "Then it's about time we knew better," was Mr. Willett's unanswerable retort. The children had been practicing their part in it for several weeks, and I knew that Mr. Annett, as choir master, had been busy with the singing which was to form part of the play. Several parents had spoken to me, rather as Mr. Willett had, expressing their grave concern about what one called doing recitations in the Lord's house. The singing passed without comment. But on the evening in question, Fairacre's villagers turned up in full force, and it was good to see the church packed. A low stage had been erected at the chancel steps, and the setting was the stable at Bethlehem. The church looked lovely, decorated for Christmas with holly wreaths and garlands of ivy, mistletoe, and fluffy old man's beard. On the altar were bowls of Christmas roses and white anemones. Only candlelight was used that evening, and the golden flames flickered like stars here and there in the shadows of the ancient church. The play was simple and moving, the country people speaking their parts with warm sincerity, but it was the unaccustomed beauty of the boys' singing that was unforgettable. Mr. Annett had wisely set aside several passages for the boys alone, and their clear oval notes echoed in the high vaulted ceiling with thrilling beauty. Whatever may have been said about such goings-on in church before the play, everyone agreed as they stopped to talk afterward in the windy churchyard that it was a moving experience. "The vicar could have done a lot worse," conceded Mr. Willett, and that indeed was high praise. The holidays slipped by with incredible speed, and early in January I was facing the school again at our first morning of the new year. There were 36 children now on the roll, and I wondered, as I watched them singing, how many I should see before me at the same time next year. Would all these older children, now making the partition rattle with their cheerful voices, have been wrested from Fairacre and be adding their numbers to those of the new school, standing on what had once been Hundred-Acre Field? Would I have a handful of infants and remain here the sole member of the staff, with one of the rooms empty of children after nearly 80 years? It was a depressing and disturbing thought, and it had occurred to me more often than I cared to admit to anyone. This was my life, as satisfying and rewarding as ever a woman could ask for, and the thought of change depressed me. Mr. Willett would say, "Cross that bridge when you get to it," I told myself, and I put these upsetting conjectures from me resolutely and determined to live for the day alone, although it was not easy. Miss Jackson had returned in high spirits. Miss Crabbe was now in the ascendant, and had evidently done her best to make the girl forget the unhappy love affair which had so unsettled her. She told me some interesting news. "Miss Crabbe is starting a small school this summer. It's to be a kindergarten school quite near the college, and she's running it on progressive lines, of course." "Of course," I echoed gravely. "She's got 2 other friends who are helping her with the money, people who are quite sure that her teaching methods are revolutionary, and she's asked me if I would like to be appointed to the staff." "And would you?" I asked unnecessarily. Hilary's face was radiant. I can't think of anything that I'd like more. There will be a house attached, as there is going to be a few boarders, the really difficult cases, and I should live there with Miss Crabbe. Won't it be lovely? I said that it sounded a most hopeful venture, and thought privately what a good thing it would be for the girl to get into another new post after all that had happened in Fairacre. She wants to open it next September and is already getting out prospectuses. Then you'll have to give in your notice here about Easter time, I said. That's right, agreed Hilary ecstatically. It will all fit in quite well, because by that time I expect the older children will have been sent on to the new school, and you won't need an assistant with just the infants. I was a trifle shaken by this calm acceptance of Fairacre's future plans, and hastened to point out that even if the estate were built, the school could not possibly be ready to house the children by next September. In that case, said Miss Jackson offhandedly, they would have to get another teacher in my place. I suppose so, I agreed. For one dreadful minute, my old doubts engulfed me. Suppose that there was no assistant to be had this time. Could I tackle the whole school for any length of time? Could I even tackle the infants if the older children had been whisked away to Beech Green, perhaps, if the new school were not ready? Would it be best for everyone if I tendered my resignation too? I thought of all the tedious business of writing out testimonials, filling in endless forms, asking people if they would stand as referees. I thought, too, of all that Fairacre and its folk had come to mean to me. No, I told myself firmly, I couldn't face it. For Fairacre's good or not, I should do my best here and be happy to stay if I were deemed fit for the job. I came to earth from this swift daydream to hear Miss Jackson speaking with great earnestness. I couldn't let Miss Crabbe down, you know. It would be unthinkable. It seemed to me in the weeks that followed that Miss Jackson's acceptance of the housing scheme as a foregone conclusion was shared by others in Fairacre and the neighborhood. It was as though the prolonged waiting had numbed the anti-estate feeling which had been so ferocious earlier in the year. The people had lived with the idea for so long now that a fatalistic resignation to what might transpire had affected quite a number of them. We must get a more efficient heating system in the church if we have to house the new people, said the vicar to his wife. The back of the church is never really warm. I'll have to think of an extra delivery van and an extra driver this time next year, said Mr. Prince, the baker, to his assistant. Even Mrs. Pringle was beginning to soften toward the project. Poor things must live somewhere, she pointed out reasonably. Do 'em good to get out into decent houses and a bit of fresh air. From the way she spoke, one might imagine they were living at the moment huddled together in sewers. But the flame still burned brightly in some breasts. Over at Springbourne, old Mr. Miller looked out at his unchanged field and the first tiny spears of his new crop in 100-acre field. They'll not shift me, he said grimly to his wife, wagging his frosted head. We'll still be here when they've gone elsewhere, and mark my words. The vicar, on hearing that Mr. Miller had planted his field, as usual, was much impressed, and said so to old Mrs. Bradley, who was present at the time. It's an act of faith, dear Mrs. Bradley, a true act of faith. Plenty of spunk there, agreed Mrs. Bradley spiritedly. Keep fighting. That's the way to gain your ends, and fight with all the weapons you can find. I myself sent a telling Christmas card to the minister at his home address. Really? Said the vicar, somewhat alarmed. He would not have put sending a bomb past this fierce old lady. A reproduction of The Dupont on the Downs, continued Mrs. Bradley, one of Dan's best pictures, and I signed it Adelaide Bradley, lover of fair play and our Downs, and added, Remember Dan Crockford for good measure. It may well have helped, said the vicar politely. Too much waiting about is making far too many faint hearts, announced Mrs. Bradley shrewdly. Up and at 'em is my motto. We'll see 'em off yet. Amy brought much the same news of Caxley's reaction to the scheme when she came to spend an evening with me. Resentment had largely been replaced by a philosophic acceptance of the affair as a necessary evil, and in fact the shopkeepers were beginning to speculate on the increase in their business which so many extra families must inevitably bring. Amy herself, however, was as militant as Mrs. Bradley. "I've sent 4 letters already to the Caxley Chronicle and 2 more to the Times about this business," she averred. "I haven't seen them," I said innocently. "For some reason they haven't been published yet," replied Amy, not a whit disturbed. "But it's the writing that matters. We mustn't give way and let things slide. Which reminds me." She scrabbled in her large crocodile handbag, a gift from James after a week's absence at a mysterious conference at a place unspecified, and handed me a book. "It's a lesson to you," said Amy firmly. "It's about a woman living alone, just as you do, on a small income with regular working day, who never lets herself go. It impressed me very much. Quite a nice little love story, too," added Amy in a patronizing tone. "Any picture strips?" I asked acidly, putting the book on my shelf. "That sort of remark," said Amy coldly, "that reveals what a frustrated woman you really are." "That be blowed," I answered indignantly and inelegantly. "Don't come the integrated married woman over me, my girl. I've known you too long. What about scrambled eggs on toast for supper?" United in common hunger, we went cheerfully together to raid the larder. Chapter 23. The Village Hears the News. March that year was one of the coldest that Fairacre had ever known. The nights were bitter, and cottage fires were kept in overnight with generous top sprinkling of small coal dampened with tea leaves, and stirred into comforting life first thing next morning. All growth was at a standstill. The small buds on the hedges were brittle to the touch, and the spear-like leaves of those hardy bulbs which had already sent them aloft grew not a whit. The birds were particularly hard hit, and not a day passed without a child bringing in a small pathetic corpse, its frail claws clenched stiffly in its last agony. The vicar grieved over the inadequate heating of St. Patrick's. Mr. Roberts, Mr. Miller, and all the neighboring farmers chafed at the delay to their crops. The children came to school wrapped up like cocoons in numberless coats and scarves, and I suffered my seasonal stiff neck from the draught from the skylight above my desk. Despite continuous stoking on my part of the tortoise stoves, the school seldom seemed really warm because of villainous draughts from ill-fitting doors and windows. The coke pile on the playground began to dwindle visibly, and Mrs. Pringle was affronted. "Good thing the office can't see the rate we're using up the fuel," she said darkly. "Must keep warm," I replied equably. "What some call warm," replied Mrs. Pringle, loosening the buttons at her neck, "others call stiflin'. Proper unhealthy in here with the stoves blazing away like that. Shouldn't be surprised if we had the chimney afire." She limped off, outraged, before I could answer. "It won't get no warmer till the snow's down," said Mr. Willett, surveying the iron-gray sky behind St. Patrick's spire. "And that won't be long now. You take your shovel indoors with you tonight, Miss Reed. Wouldn't mind betting us has a bit of digging out to do tomorrow." Mr. Willett was right. The first flakes began to flutter down early in the afternoon. I was putting a writing copy on the blackboard and wishing that my own handwriting were as elegant as Miss Clare's had been, when I heard the excited whispers behind me. "Snow! Look, it's snowing! Smashing! Reckon it'll settle? 'Tisn't half snowing, too, coming down a tree." The children were bobbing up from their seats the better to see this wonder through the high windows. Their faces were radiant. Here was drama indeed, and with any luck they might be sent home a few minutes early. Their day was made. Within 10 minutes the snow was falling steadily, whispering sibilantly along the windowsills outside and covering the playground, the coke pile, and the roofs with a white canopy. As the children finished their writing, they were allowed to go to the windows to watch. They gazed entranced, looking up at the whirling flakes as they swirled down and making themselves deliciously dizzy at the sight. "Miss," burst out Eric, "they's black coming down, black snowflakes. Come and look." The scene outside might have come from a Christmas card. The bare black trees stood out starkly against their gray background, and the bulk of the church loomed larger than ever against the heavy sky. The church windows glowed with lights within the building, and I guessed that Mr. Willett was stoking up the stove again. Along the lane, I could see two small figures bent against the onslaught. They each carried a shopping bag, and I suspected the Coggs twins, ostensibly absent from school with unspecified ailments, had been sent up shop by their mother. I watched their red coats vanish round the bend and realized that the only spot of vivid color had now gone. The thatched roofs, the gardens, hedges, and ground were all in muted shades of gray, black, and white. At playtime, the children had a few delicious minutes out among the flakes. I watched Patrick scoop up a handful of snow from the window ledge and eat it rapturously. "S'lovely!" he shouted to the others, looking up with sparkling eyes and a thick white fringe round his wet red mouth. The rest skimmed down and round like swifts, screaming as shrilly and licking up the wonderful stuff with their flying heels. When they came in, they stood apple-cheeked, warming their pink hands over the stove and chattering away about the joys in store for them, if only it lays. It continued to snow heavily, and Miss Jackson and I sent the children home 10 minutes early. It was settling even then to a depth of 2 or 3 inches, and I feared that it would be over the top of some of the smaller children's shoes. We wrapped them up as best we could. They stood chafing at the delay as we buttoned coats and tied bonnet strings, and the minute that they could break away from our grasp, they rushed ecstatically out into this glorious new world which had miraculously been transformed from everyday Fairacre. There was an orchestral rehearsal that evening, and I made my usual trip to Beech Green to mind Malcolm Annett while his parents went to Caxley. The snow lay thickly on the verges of the road, in the crooks of the trees, and along their branches, but the road itself was easily traversed. Malcolm had become a vivacious toddler with only one thing in mind: farm machinery. He was as elated as the school children were about the snow, but this did not deflect him from his usual obsession, and whenever the sound of passing vehicles was heard, he bolted to the window, shouting hopefully, "Tractor!" His dearest possession was a red model tractor which accompanied him everywhere. Teddies, gollywogs, soft animals, and all the other former loves now languished in the toy cupboard. To my inquiries after their well-being and his own health and interests, he answered brightly, "Tractor," holding up the object for my inspection. "I must say it's a bit tedious," said his mother plaintively, "and when I mislaid it the other day, I thought he'd have apoplexy." The conversation turned to Miss Clare, while Malcolm shunted the tractor blissfully back and forth between our feet on the hearthrug. "We loved having her with us on holiday last summer," said Isabel, "and George and I talked it over with Dr. Martin when she was groggy again later on, and we suggested she might like to come and live here if she ever found her own house too much for her." "I'm very glad," I answered, "but did she accept the idea?" "Not at first," said George. "In any case, it is far better for her to manage on her own in her own home, for as long as she can comfortably do so. I hear Miss Jackson's likely to go." I said it looked as though she would be leaving Fairacre at the end of the summer, and told them what I knew of her plans. "Lord," said George Annett with profound awe, "think of Miss Jackson and Miss Crabbe on one staff." They went on to tell me about the provision of a suitable lodger for Miss Clare, as long as she wanted one. "I can never find enough decent accommodation for my young staff," said George. "Any one of them would jump at the chance of being with Dolly Clare." "And we're keeping a room ready here where she can have all her things and make her home," continued his wife. "She could let her cottage probably, and that would bring her a little income. It's all very much in the future, we hope, but she has promised to come if she needs to, and we are all of us, and Dr. Martin too, very much relieved." I said that it was a most satisfactory arrangement, and thought what thoroughly good-hearted people these two Annetts were. "Look at the clock," exclaimed George, jumping to his feet. "Come on, Isabel, we'll be late." The usual scurrying began with Isabel shouting last-minute injunctions about her son's needs as she dressed. "Let him have plenty of supper. He won't bother to eat during the day. And when he goes to bed, don't forget that he always takes—" "Don't tell me," I said. "I can guess." "Tractor," said my intelligent and besotted godson. The snow continued intermittently for over a week, much to the joy of the children and the annoyance of their parents as they struggled about their affairs in a white world. It was during this bleak period that a meeting was held by the Rural District Council at the offices in Caxley. Muffled in thick overcoats and scarves and beating their leather gloves together, the members made their way up the stairs to the committee room, among them Mr. Roberts from Fairacre, accompanied by a cheerful young reporter from the Caxley Chronicle. They little realized what momentous news they would hear, for although the agenda lay in their pockets, the clerk to the RDC had received that morning a missive from the Minister of Housing and Local Government, sharing that honor with the clerk to the County Council and the representative of the Atomic Energy Authority, who had also received similar messages. It was this delicious letter which the clerk looked forward to reading to his fellow councilors. Within an hour, the meeting was over, and down the stairs tumbled the councilors with most gratified expressions. Mr. Roberts' great laugh shook some flaking plaster from the hall ceiling as they emerged, and the young reporter tore along the snowy streets to the offices of the Caxley Chronicle with the biggest scoop of his brief career. This, surely, he could sell to a national daily and win himself not only the approval from his own local editor, but a guinea or two from the lords of Fleet Street. Mr. Roberts drove through the black and white lanes to Fairacre in roaring good spirits. As he passed Hundred Acre Field, a sheet of unsullied whiteness stretching to the misty obscurity of the downs behind, Mr. Roberts gave it an affectionate wink and a smile. His wife was making dripping toast for tea when he entered the farmhouse kitchen. He kissed her boisterously, told her the good tidings, and inspected the toast. It was a delicacy of which Mr. Roberts was a connoisseur. "Plenty of that brown gooby from the bottom, my dear, and a good sprinkling of salt," he directed as he made his way to the telephone. Anxious as he was to let one or two intimates know the good news, Mr. Roberts recognized there was a time and place for everything. Dripping toast has as much right to respect as parish affairs, and at tea time on winter afternoon it must take pride of place. "I'll go," said the vicar when he heard the telephone bell. He heaved himself from his shabby leather armchair by the fire and hurried into the drafty tiled hall where the vicarage phone was housed. "I can hardly believe it," Mrs. Partridge heard her husband say. "Indeed, Roberts, it's almost more than I can take in. Thank you 1,000 times for telling me." She heard the tinkle as the vicar replaced the telephone, and a moment later he appeared in the doorway. He held out both hands to her and looked strangely moved. "There is to be no housing estate. The minister has made his decision known. It will be in the Caxley Chronicle the day after tomorrow." Mrs. Partridge gripped her husband's hands thankfully. Tears, which did not come easily to the robust Mrs. Partridge, filled her eyes as she felt relief flooding her. "It's a direct answer to prayer," said the vicar gently. "I shall give public thanks in church next Sunday." "That's a baby arriving," said Dr. Martin, setting down his unsipped tea as he heard the telephone. "It can damn well wait half an hour." He shifted the receiver that lay within arm's reach on top of the bookshelf. "Ah, Roberts," he smiled across at his wife. "Stand back a bit from the blower, man. You're deafening me." The roaring noise, which Mrs. Martin could hear, subsided slightly. The doctor's face grew more and more pleased as he listened. "Best news I've heard this year," exclaimed the doctor delightedly. "It solves a lot of my problems as well as everyone else's. Many thanks for letting me know." He put down the receiver and beamed at his wife. "You can put all those plans about moving out of your head, my dear. The housing scheme is off." He took a long, satisfying draught from his teacup. "Thank God for that," said Mrs. Bradley when she heard the news. "If anything had happened to Dan Crockford's field, I think it would have killed me." She paused to listen to Mr. Roberts' booming voice giving further particulars of the minister's decision. "Well, all I can say is this," cackled the old lady mischievously. "It was that Christmas card of mine that did the trick. I told you, and we must keep fighting. And now, you see, we've won." George Annett heard the news later that evening when the vicar telephoned him about some arrangements for next Sunday's anthem. He rushed at once to the sitting room where his wife and Miss Clare sat listening to the news on the wireless. "Switch that off," ordered Mr. Annett excitedly, "and I'll tell you some real news that'll make that international stuff look pretty silly." The two women gazed at him in surprise, but Isabel obediently switched off. "Now then, this had better be good," she said warningly. "It is," responded her husband proudly. "We're not going to have a housing estate." And snatching 2 knitting needles from Miss Clare's lap, he set them crosswise on the carpet and executed a lively sword dance, complete with triumphant, blood-curdling cries, much to the delight of the ladies. Over at Springborn late that night, Mr. Miller filled 4 glasses. He had heard the wonderful news earlier that day by letter from the Rural District Council, and he looked upon it as a personal reprieve. His 2 distinguished sons were at home when the news came, and they agreed that their father had shed 20 years from his 80 as he perused the letter. They stood now, glasses in hand, smiling warmly upon their sprightly father. Old Mr. Miller raised his glass to his wife. "To our home," he said simply. Chapter 24. Farewell to Fairacre. During the night, a warm westerly wind blew across the downs, and Fairacre folk woke to find that the thaw had started. The thatched roofs dripped under a warm sun, little streams began to trickle in the gutters, the thirsty birds rejoiced in the puddles, and life began to stir again. The thermometers rose steadily, and as the news of the minister's findings began to circulate with the village's customary briskness, the spirits of all who lived in Fairacre and Beech Green rose too. Many a village quarrel was patched up that morning. With such sunshine and such news, such relief from iron-hard frost and restricting suspense, it was impossible to pass a neighbor, even if one had been on no speaking terms for months, without stopping for a lively gossip. At back store steps, over hedges, in the village street, in the grocer's shop, and at the post office, the loosened tongues wagged. A great burden had been lifted, and life in Fairacre rattled on all the more lightly and merrily. "'Twould never have done," repeated Mr. Willett. "I said at the beginning that 'twould never have done. Fairacre takes a bit of beating as it is." "I'll believe it when I sees it," said Mrs. Pringle. "I've heard too many rumors flying about lately for me to put much store in a lot of idle chitter-chatter. I'll wait till I sees it put plain in the paper." We did not have to wait long, for the Caxley Chronicle came out the next morning and had given pride of place to the youthful reporter's notice of the meeting. In view of the government's recent decision for stringent cuts in expenditure, and having given the objections raised by local bodies his earnest attention, the minister has decided with reluctance that the present housing estate scheme must be abandoned. Everyone in Fairacre, Beech Green, and Caxley pointed out to his neighbor the minister had put the less important factor first. Naturally, it was the fighting spirit of the local inhabitants that had forced the issue. But as the minister had seen reason in the end, no one was going to quarrel with him over this relatively minor point. "And give the chap his due," Mr. Willett pointed out reasonably enough. "He do seem to have sat up there cudgelling his brains over this here business ever since last October. Say what you like, after 6 months' honest thinking, he's pretty well bound to have got the right answer." "And that he have," agreed Mr. Lamb from the post office with conviction, and all the neighborhood with rejoicing hearts concurred. The spring term had ended in a spell of warm sunshine which looked as though it might well stay for the Easter holidays. The children had run home on that last afternoon, hugging their bright Easter eggs carefully to their chests and chorusing cheerfully, "Goodbye, miss! Happy Easter, miss!" When I answered with, "Be good children and help your mothers," and some wag had called with well-simulated innocence, "Same to you, miss," their delight knew no bounds. It was a retort which would doubtless go down into Fairacre history. The first morning of the holiday was so fair and sweet that I readily turned my back upon household affairs and set out for a walk on top of the downs. I chose the narrow, little-used lane that winds steeply up the slope of the downs, beginning among trees which form a leafy tunnel in the summer, and now showed the first small fans of breaking leaves and later emerged into the bare, open downland. The scent of spring was everywhere, heady and hopeful, and as I gained the upper slopes, I could hear the numberless larks caroling. I remembered Mr. Maughan's remark, "More larks to the square yard on those downs than anywhere else I know." Puffed by now, I arrived at a 5-barreled gate at the side of the lane, and leant gratefully upon it, looking down at a view spread below me. What an escape we had had when the housing scheme had been abandoned. A fine blue haze lay over the valley. Away to my right lay Beech Green. Miss Clare's cottage, tucked in a fold of the downs, was hidden from my view, but the reprieved 100-acre field lay spread there, tinged with tender green. Mr. Miller had weathered his storm bravely, I thought, and for that matter, hadn't we all during this last year? I remembered the anxiety of the vicar, of Mr. Willett and Mrs. Pringle, and of all those among us whose lives would have been shaken by the advent of the new town. I remembered, too, Hilary Jackson's stormy passage, Miss Crabb's brief passion, dear Miss Clare's fight for health, and Joseph Cogg's rebellion. But that was behind us now. The storm had passed, the sunshine warmed my bare head, and I remembered with an uprush of spirit that the barometer had said, "Set fair," when I had tapped it that morning. I took a last look at Fairacre away below me. There it lay in a comfortable hollow of the sheltering downs, ringed with trees that hid many of the thatched roofs from sight. But the spire of St. Patrick's pierced the greenery like an upthrust finger, and at its tip the weathercock, glinting in the morning sunlight, seemed to crow a challenge to all comers. Well satisfied, I turned my back upon Fairacre, happy in the knowledge that however far I journeyed, it would always be there waiting for me, timeless and unchanged. The end.